The morning sun cast long shadows across the elegant driveway of the Henderson estate, a sprawling mansion that had stood in the heart of Greenwich, Connecticut for over 60 years. A woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun stood at the imposing iron gates with her arms crossed firmly over her chest. Her weathered hands gripped a clipboard, and her sensible shoes were planted firmly on the cobblestone path. She had been the head housekeeper of this property for 23 years, and in all that time, she had never seen anything quite like what was happening today. A sleek black Mercedes pulled up to the gate, its polished exterior reflecting the morning light like a mirror. The window rolled down slowly, revealing a man in his late 30s with sharp features, expensive sunglasses, and a tailored suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. His jaw was set with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. "Excuse me, I need you to open the gate," the man said, his tone polite but firm, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. Didn't budge. She consulted her clipboard with deliberate slowness, running her finger down a list of names and appointments. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't have you on the visitor list for today. Mr. Henderson left strict instructions that no one was to enter the property without prior authorization." The man removed his sunglasses, revealing piercing blue eyes that studied with a mixture of confusion and growing frustration. "I think there's been some misunderstanding. I'm David Henderson. This is my house." His expression remained unchanged. She had dealt with enough ambitious journalists and overeager real estate developers over the years to develop a healthy skepticism. "Sir, I've worked for the Henderson family for over 2 decades. I know every member of this family personally. Mr. Richard Henderson is currently in Europe on business, and his son Christopher is at university in Boston. There is no David Henderson that I'm aware of." The man in the Mercedes let out a slow breath, clearly trying to maintain his composure. "Look, I understand your confusion, but I can assure you I am Richard Henderson's son. I've been living abroad for the past 15 years. If you could just call the main house or contact Mr. Henderson directly, we can clear this up." Grip on her clipboard tightened. Something about this situation felt off. Richard Henderson had mentioned only one son during all her years of service. Christopher was 22, finishing his business degree, and frequently visited the estate during holidays. This man claiming to be David looked nothing like Richard or Christopher. Where they had warm, approachable features and sandy brown hair, this stranger possessed sharp, almost aristocratic features with jet black hair and those penetrating blue eyes. "I'm afraid I can't do that, sir. Mr. Henderson was very clear about security protocols. No exceptions." Reached for the phone at the guard booth. "However, I can call the police if you continue to insist on entering private property." The threat of police involvement seemed to surprise the man. He held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Please, let's not escalate this unnecessarily. Is there anyone else on the property I could speak with? Perhaps the estate manager or Mr. Henderson's personal assistant?" Considered this for a moment. The estate manager had been with the family almost as long as she had. If anyone could verify or disprove this man's claims, it would be him. "Wait here," she instructed, her tone brooking no argument. She picked up the phone and dialed the main house. Inside the mansion was reviewing the monthly expenses in the study when the phone rang. At 67, had served 3 generations of Hendersons, and he prided himself on knowing everything about the family and their affairs. He answered on the second ring. "It's from the gate. We have a situation. There's a man here claiming to be David Henderson, says he's Mr. Richard's son. He wants access to the property." His face went pale. He set down his pen carefully, his hand trembling slightly. "What does he look like?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Described the man in detail while listened in growing silence. When she finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Don't let him leave," finally said. "I'm coming down there immediately. Don't open that gate, but don't let him drive away either. This is important." The urgency in his voice was unlike anything it heard before. In all their years working together had always been the picture of calm professionalism. Now he sounded shaken, almost frightened. 10 minutes later, his golf cart came racing down the long driveway, moving faster than had ever seen him drive. He practically leaped out before it came to a complete stop. His eyes were fixed on the man still waiting patiently in the Mercedes, and watched as a complex series of emotions crossed his weathered face. Shock, recognition, fear, and something that looked almost like grief. The man in the car stepped out, standing tall and straight. He was even more impressive outside the vehicle, easily 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and an athletic build. He looked at with an expression that was difficult to read, somewhere between hope and resignation. The man said simply, "It's been a long time." His voice cracked when he spoke. "David, is it really you?" His jaw dropped. In all her years at the estate, she had never heard mention anyone named David. The old estate manager moved closer to the gate, his eyes filling with tears. "I thought you were dead," whispered. "We all thought you were dead." David's expression softened slightly. "I know, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for a lot of things, but I need to come home. I need to explain everything." Found her voice, though it came out more sharply than she intended. "What's going on? Who is this man?" Turned to her, and she was shocked to see tears streaming down his cheeks. "This is David Henderson, Richard's eldest son. He disappeared 15 years ago when he was 23. There was an accident, a car crash. They found his car at the bottom of a ravine, burned beyond recognition. They never found remains, but everyone assumed he died in the fire. Richard had a funeral, buried an empty casket. The family mourned. Christopher was only 7 years old when his big brother vanished." The weight of this revelation hung in the air like a physical presence. Looked between and David, her mind racing. But if he's been alive all this time, why didn't he come back? Why let his family think he was dead? David's jaw tightened. "That's a very long story, and one I'd prefer to tell inside if you'll let me. I know I have no right to ask for understanding, not yet. But I promise you I had reasons. Whether they were good reasons or not isn't for me to judge." Pulled out his keys with shaking hands and moved toward the gate lock. Grabbed his arm. "Wait, how can you be sure this is really him? It's been 15 years, people can be deceived. What if this is some elaborate con?" It was a fair question, and David seemed to expect it. He reached into his jacket pocket slowly, careful not to alarm them, and pulled out an old leather wallet. From it, he extracted a faded photograph. He passed it through the bars of the gate, too. Took the photo with trembling hands. It showed 2 boys, one in his early 20s with dark hair and piercing blue eyes, the other a child of perhaps 7 with sandy brown hair and a gap-toothed smile. They were standing in front of this very mansion, their arms around each other, laughing at something off camera. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "David and Christopher, summer 2009. "Christopher gave me this the day before the accident," David said quietly. He'd taken it with that disposable camera he'd gotten for his birthday. He was so proud of himself for developing the film all by himself. He wrote our names on the back because he said that way, in 100 years, people would know we were brothers. His resolve crumbled. He unlocked the gate with fumbling fingers. "God forgive me if I'm making a mistake, but I believe you. I believe you're David. Those eyes, they're exactly like your mother's. I should have recognized them immediately." As the gate swung open, stepped forward, her voice stern despite the emotional chaos swirling around them. "Mr. Henderson, if that's truly who you are, you need to understand something. Your father is a different man than the one you left behind. Christopher has grown up believing his brother died. You can't just walk back into their lives and expect everything to go back to normal. Whatever your reasons for staying away, you've caused immeasurable pain to people who loved you." David met her gaze steadily. "You're absolutely right, and I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything except the chance to explain. After that, if they want me to leave and never come back, I'll respect that decision." The drive up to the main house was silent except for the crunch of gravel under tires. Rode in the golf cart with, while David followed in his Mercedes. The mansion grew larger as they approached, its limestone facade gleaming in the morning sun. David seemed to take in every detail as if memorizing it, or perhaps remembering it. When they reached the circular driveway in front of the main entrance, David parked and sat in his car for a long moment before emerging. His confident demeanor had faded, replaced by something that looked like vulnerability, perhaps even fear. The mansion's front doors were massive oak affairs, carved with intricate designs that had been commissioned by David's grandfather in the 1950s. Unlocked them and pushed them open, revealing the grand foyer beyond. Crystal chandeliers caught the light streaming through tall windows. A sweeping staircase curved up to the second floor. Everything was exactly as David remembered it, and yet somehow different, as if he were seeing it through the lens of all the years that had passed. "The house looks the same," David said softly, his voice carrying an echo in the vast space. "I thought he might have changed things." His expression was complicated. "Your father couldn't bring himself to change anything in your room. It's exactly as you left it. He'd go in there sometimes, especially in the early years, just sit there for hours. Eventually he stopped, but he never let anyone touch anything. The pain in David's face was evident. I didn't want to hurt him, you have to believe that. Who had been observing this reunion with a mixture of suspicion and growing sympathy, finally spoke. Then why did you? Why fake your death? Why stay away for 15 years? What could possibly justify that? David walked to one of the tall windows and looked out at the manicured grounds. His reflection in the glass showed a man wrestling with difficult memories. I was trying to protect them, he said finally. From me and from choices I'd made, choices that would have destroyed this family's reputation and put them in danger. And exchanged glances. The old estate manager moved to the bar cart in the corner and poured 3 glasses of brandy, even though it was barely noon. He handed 1 and 1 to David, keeping the third for himself. I think you'd better start from the beginning, said, settling into one of the leather armchairs. And don't leave anything out. If you're back after all this time, we deserve the whole truth. David took a long drink from his glass, savoring the burn of the expensive liquor. Then he began to speak, and the story that emerged was nothing like what anyone expected. When I was 23, I was arrogant and stupid. I thought I knew everything. Dad wanted me to go into the family business, to learn about real estate development and investment banking. But I thought I was smarter than that. I thought I could make my own fortune, my own name, without relying on the Henderson wealth. He paused, collecting his thoughts. I got involved with some people in New York. They seemed legitimate at first. A group of young entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, people who talked about disrupting industries and changing the world. They had big ideas and bigger ambitions. I invested heavily with them. Not just my trust fund money, but I convinced Dad to invest too, millions of dollars. Leaned forward, her earlier suspicion giving way to fascination. What happened? It was a scam, a sophisticated one, but a scam nonetheless. The whole operation was a front for money laundering. These people were connected to organized crime, washing dirty money through what looked like legitimate business ventures. By the time I realized what was really going on, it was too late. I was in deep, and so was my family's money. His face had gone pale. How much? $47 million, David said flatly. Gone, and worse than that, because I'd been involved in making decisions, signing documents, moving money around. I was implicated. I wasn't just a victim. I was an accomplice, whether I meant to be or not. The number hung in the air like a grenade, felt her breath catch. That kind of loss would have been devastating to most families, but the Hendersons could have survived it financially. But the scandal, the criminal implications, that would have been another matter entirely. Federal investigators started looking into the operation, David continued. I knew it was only a matter of time before they came for me. And these people I'd been involved with, they didn't take kindly to anyone who might talk to authorities. I started getting threats. Subtle ones at first, then more direct. Someone broke into my apartment. I found a bullet on my pillow with a note that said, "Keep quiet or your family pays." He turned from the window to face them directly. I went to Dad. I told him everything. I've never seen him so angry, not disappointed, not sad, but furious and terrified. He realized immediately how much danger we were all in. These weren't street criminals. These were sophisticated, connected people with resources and no conscience. His hand shook as he raised his glass. Why didn't he go to the authorities? Your father knows people, has connections. He could have gotten protection. He wanted to, David said, but I'd been too deeply involved. The lawyers we consulted said I was looking at serious prison time. 5 to 10 years minimum, and the scandal would have destroyed everything Dad had built. The Henderson name, the business relationships, the charitable foundations, everything. And worse, the threats against the family would have continued. These people had long memories. Found herself understanding, against her better judgment. So you decided to disappear. David nodded slowly. Dad and I came up with a plan. It was desperate, probably illegal in its own right, but we were out of options. I would stage my death. A car accident, the body burned beyond recognition. There would be no investigation because it would look like a tragic accident. The people who were threatening us would think I was dead, so the threat would end. The federal investigation would close because their key witness was gone. And Dad could tell everyone that his son died before any of the scandal broke, preserving the family's reputation. But the money was still gone, pointed out. Dad reported it as a failed investment, took the loss. It hurt, but it didn't destroy the business. He quietly severed all connections with those people. With me dead, they had no reason to come after the family. It worked. As horrible as it was, it worked. Stood and paced the room, her mind working through the implications. So you've been hiding for 15 years? Where? How? I went to Southeast Asia first. Thailand, then Vietnam, then Indonesia. I lived simply, kept a low profile. Dad sent me money through untraceable channels, enough to survive, but not enough to attract attention. I changed my name, my appearance, my entire life. I learned languages, took jobs teaching English, working in hotels, doing whatever I needed to do to stay invisible. His voice cracked slightly. I missed Christopher's graduation from elementary school, his high school years, his college acceptance. I missed Dad's 60th birthday, his retirement from active management of the company. I missed funerals of people I cared about, weddings of friends. I missed everything that mattered because I was too much of a coward to face the consequences of my mistakes. The raw pain in his voice was undeniable, felt her remaining skepticism crumbling. This wasn't the story of a con man trying to infiltrate a wealthy family. This was the confession of a man who had been living in a self-imposed exile, carrying the weight of his choices for a decade and a half. "Why come back now?" asked quietly. "After all this time, what changed?" David pulled out his phone and brought up a photograph. He handed it to who looked at it and immediately understood. The photo showed a young woman, maybe 25, with bright eyes and a warm smile. She was holding a baby. "Her name is Sarah," David said softly. "We met 3 years ago in Bali. She's a teacher from Australia. She doesn't know the truth about my past. She thinks I'm just an American expatriate who loves traveling. We got married last year, and that's our daughter, Emma. She's 6 months old." His voice became firmer. "I can't raise my daughter on a lie. I can't have her grow up never knowing her grandfather, her uncle, her heritage. And Sarah deserves to know the truth about who she married. I've been a coward for 15 years. I'm trying not to be one anymore." Found herself blinking back tears. She'd come down to the gate this morning expecting just another day of managing the household. Instead, she'd been thrown into a drama that was reshaping everything she thought she knew about the family she'd served for so long. "Does Richard know you're coming?" asked. David shook his head. "I couldn't risk calling. I didn't know if he'd want to see me. I didn't know if he'd forgiven me or if he even could. I just knew I had to come home and face whatever consequences waited for me." Set down his glass and stood. "Richard is in London. He's been meeting with investors about a new development project. He's due back tomorrow evening." "And Christopher?" David asked, hope and fear mingling in his voice. "Christopher is in Boston, but he's coming home this weekend. He's bringing his girlfriend to meet Richard. It's serious, apparently. They're talking about engagement." David absorbed this information with visible emotion. "My little brother is all grown up and in love. I've missed so much." Finally spoke, her voice gentler than before. "Mr. Henderson, David, I need to ask you something important. What if they don't forgive you? What if Richard is too hurt or Christopher too angry? What if coming back does more harm than good?" David met her gaze squarely. "Then I'll leave. I'll go back to Sarah and Emma and I'll tell them the truth about everything. I'll face whatever legal consequences might still exist. But at least I'll have tried. At least I'll have stopped running." The three of them sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of David's story settling over them like a blanket. Outside, the sun continued its journey across the sky, indifferent to the human drama unfolding within the mansion's walls. Finally broke the silence. "You should stay, at least until Richard returns. You've come this far, you can stay in the guest house. And I won't tell anyone you're here until you've had a chance to talk to your father. You two need to sort this out before anyone else gets involved." David looked grateful beyond words. Thank you both. I know I don't deserve your kindness or your discretion." Surprised herself by reaching out and touching his arm. "We all make mistakes, Mr. Henderson, some bigger than others, but you're trying to make it right. That counts for something." As led David out to the guest house, a small cottage tucked behind the main mansion, stayed behind in the grand foyer. She looked around at the opulent surroundings, at the family portraits lining the walls, at the lifetime of history contained within these rooms. Somewhere among those portraits was a younger David, frozen in time, preserved in the memory of a family that had mourned him. Tomorrow, everything would change. Richard Henderson would return from London to find his dead son alive and asking for forgiveness. Christopher would learn that the brother he'd grieved for half his life was back. The careful fiction that had protected the family for 15 years would crumble, and whatever came next was anyone's guess. Picked up her clipboard and headed toward the kitchen. There was work to be done. No matter what revelations the day had brought, the household still needed to run. But as she walked through the familiar corridors, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just witnessed the beginning of something. The guest house had been designed as a retreat for visitors who wanted privacy while staying on the estate. It was smaller than the main mansion, but still luxurious, with 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and large windows overlooking the gardens. David stood in the living room, his hands in his pockets, staring at the familiar surroundings as if seeing them for the first time. Had left him alone to settle in, promising to return later with some food and supplies. Now David walked slowly through the rooms, touching surfaces, examining objects, reconnecting with a life he'd abandoned. On a shelf, he found a book he remembered reading as a teenager. In a drawer, there were old board games he and Christopher used to play on rainy afternoons. Every item was a ghost from his past, reminding him of what he'd given up. He pulled out his phone and looked at the photo of Sarah and Emma again. His wife's smile was genuine, full of trust and love. Emma's tiny face was peaceful in sleep. They were waiting for him in a hotel in Manhattan, believing he was handling some business matters before they all went to meet his family. Sarah thought it would be a happy reunion. She had no idea about the complex web of lies and secrets she was about to walk into. David sat down on the sofa and put his head in his hands. The enormity of what he was doing finally hit him. For 15 years, he'd survived by not thinking too hard about the people he'd left behind. He'd built walls around those memories, locked them away where they couldn't hurt him. But now those walls were crumbling and the pain was overwhelming. There was a knock at the door. David looked up to find standing there with a tray of food and a pot of coffee. She'd changed from her formal housekeeper's uniform into more casual clothing, though her demeanor remained professional. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, entering without waiting for an invitation. She set the tray on the coffee table and poured 2 cups of coffee. "I also thought you might want some company, or someone to talk to who isn't as emotionally invested as." David accepted the coffee gratefully. "Thank you, and thank you for earlier at the gate. You were just doing your job, protecting the family. I respect that." Sat down in an armchair across from him. "Tell me about your wife. Sarah, you said her name was." A genuine smile crossed David's face, the first had seen. "She's remarkable. She teaches elementary school in Melbourne, but she was traveling during a gap year when we met. She's kind and patient and has this way of seeing the best in people, even when they don't deserve it." "Does she know any of the truth?" David shook his head. "She knows I had a difficult relationship with my family, that we've been estranged for many years. She thinks it's because I rejected my father's expectations and chose a different path. It's not entirely a lie, but it's not the whole truth either. I've been a coward about telling her." Studied him carefully. "You know that when you tell your father and brother the truth, it's going to come out. Everything. The money, the criminals, the fake death, all of it. Your wife will learn about it whether you tell her yourself or not." "I know. I'm planning to tell her tonight after I leave here. She deserves to hear it from me before she meets my family. I just hope she doesn't take Emma and leave. I wouldn't blame her if she did." "If she loves you, she'll stay," said simply. "Love means accepting people's pasts, even the messy parts, but you have to give her the chance to make that choice." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, drinking their coffee, then asked the question that had been bothering her since David's arrival. "What happened to the people who threatened you? The criminals you were involved with? Are they still a danger?" David's expression darkened. "Most of them were arrested about 8 years ago. A federal task force finally built a case strong enough to take them down. I read about it in the news. The main players got long prison sentences, some of them flipped and against the others. The whole operation collapsed." "So you've been safe to come home for 8 years, but you didn't." His tone was sharp. "You let your family think you were dead for 8 extra years after the danger had passed." The accusation stung because it was true. David set down his coffee cup and met her eyes. "You're right, I could have come back sooner, but by then I'd been gone for 7 years. Christopher had grown up without me. Dad had moved on. I told myself they were better off without me, that reopening old wounds would only cause more pain. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared of facing them, scared of their anger, scared of trying to explain the inexplicable." "So what changed?" pressed. "Why now?" "Emma," David said simply. When she was born and I held her for the first time, I realized I didn't want her to grow up the way I had been living, running from the truth, hiding from the past, building a life on foundations of lies. I want her to know her family, her real family. I want her to be proud of her father, not because I'm perfect, but because when I made mistakes, I eventually found the courage to face them. His expression softened slightly. That's a good reason, maybe the only reason that really matters. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. Mr. Henderson arrives home tomorrow at 6 in the evening. His flight lands at 4 and his driver will pick him up. He always goes straight to his study when he gets home from trips. That's where he keeps the photo of you, the one from your high school graduation. He still looks at it sometimes. I've seen him. David felt tears prick his eyes. Thank you for telling me that. After left, David spent the rest of the day walking the grounds of the estate. He visited the tennis courts where he and Christopher used to play. He stood by the pool where they'd spent countless summer afternoons. He walked through the gardens his mother had designed before she died when he was 16. Every corner of the property held memories, and he let them wash over him, accepting both the joy and the pain they brought. As evening fell, he returned to the guest house and called Sarah. She answered on the first ring, Emma babbling happily in the background. "How did it go?" Sarah asked, her voice warm and curious. "Did you meet with your business contacts?" David closed his eyes. "Sarah, I need to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago. Can you get someone to watch Emma for a few hours? I'm coming into the city. We need to talk." The change in his tone must have alarmed her because her voice became cautious. "David, what's wrong? You're scaring me." "I know, and I'm sorry, but this is important. This is about my family, my past, and things I haven't been honest about. You deserve to know the truth before we go any further." There was a long pause. "Okay, I'll call the hotel's babysitting service. How soon can you be here?" 2 hours. I'll meet you in the lobby bar." The drive into Manhattan gave David time to organize his thoughts, but no amount of preparation could make what he had to do any easier. He'd rehearsed the conversation 100 times in his mind, trying different approaches, different explanations. None of them felt adequate. Sarah was waiting for him in the hotel bar, looking beautiful but worried. Her long brown hair was pulled back, and she wore a simple dress that Emma had probably spit up on at least once that day. She stood when she saw him, and David could see the questions in her eyes. They sat in a quiet corner, away from other guests. David ordered 2 glasses of wine, though he wasn't sure either of them would drink. Then he took Sarah's hands in his and began to speak. "My name isn't David," he started. "It's David Henderson. And 15 years ago, I faked my own death to escape from criminals I'd gotten involved with and to protect my family from a scandal that would have destroyed them." Sarah's face went pale. She pulled her hands back slowly, as if touching him might burn her. "What?" And so David told her everything. The failed investments, the money laundering, the threats, the staged accident. He told her about his father, his brother, the 15 years of exile. He told her about the fear and the guilt and the cowardice that had kept him away even after the danger had passed. He left nothing out, no matter how damaging to his character it might be. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression moving through shock, disbelief, anger, and something that might have been betrayal. When he finished, silence hung between them like a physical barrier. "So our entire relationship is built on a lie," Sarah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not who you said you were. Your family isn't dead like you implied. You're not just an expatriate finding himself. You're a fugitive from your own life." "Yes," David said, not trying to defend himself. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. You deserve to know the truth from the beginning." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Do you have any idea how this makes me feel? I married you, David. I had your child. I trusted you completely. And all this time you've been lying to me about who you are, where you come from, everything that made you the person you claim to be. I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I'm telling you now because I can't keep lying. I'm going to face my family tomorrow. I'm going to tell them everything and accept whatever consequences come from that. And you have every right to take Emma and go home to Australia and never speak to me again. I'll understand if that's what you choose." Sarah wiped her tears angrily. "Don't tell me what I have a right to do. I'll decide that for myself." She stood up abruptly. "I need time to think. I need to process this. I need to figure out if the man I fell in love with even exists or if he was just another character you were playing." "Sarah, please." "No," she cut him off. You don't get to ask me for anything right now. You lied to me for 3 years. You let me believe we were building a life together based on honesty and trust, and it was all false. I need space to figure out what that means." She walked away, leaving David alone at the table with 2 untouched glasses of wine. He'd known this was a possibility, even a likelihood, but knowing it and experiencing it were 2 different things. The thought of losing Sarah and Emma, on top of potentially losing any chance of reconciliation with his father and brother, made him feel like he was drowning. He returned to the estate late that night, parking the Mercedes in front of the guest house. The main mansion was dark except for a few lights that stayed on all night for security. Somewhere in there and were probably sleeping, preparing for tomorrow's reckoning. David knew he should try to sleep too, but his mind was racing too fast. Instead, he walked. He wandered the property in the darkness, guided by memory and moonlight. He ended up at the family cemetery, a small plot surrounded by an iron fence where generations of Hendersons had been laid to rest. His mother was buried there, and his grandparents and other relatives going back over a century. And there, in a corner of the cemetery, was his own headstone. David stood before it, reading the inscription by moonlight. David Richard Henderson, beloved son and brother, 1986-2009. Gone too soon but never forgotten. The date of death was the day of the accident, the day he'd driven his car off that ravine and walked away, leaving everyone to believe he'd burned to death. He'd been 23 years old, full of arrogance and bad decisions. Now he was 38, a husband and father carrying the weight of 15 years of lies. He sat down on the ground in front of his own grave and finally let himself cry. Great, racking sobs that shook his whole body. He cried for the boy he'd been, for the man he'd become, for all the years he'd lost with his family. He cried for Sarah's trust that he'd shattered, for Emma's innocence that would inevitably be tainted by his mistakes. He cried for his father, who'd had to bury an empty casket and live with the secret of what they'd done. He cried for Christopher, who'd lost his brother at the most vulnerable age. When the tears finally stopped, David felt hollowed out but strangely clearer. Tomorrow he would face his father. He would tell the truth, accept the consequences, and let the pieces fall where they may. He couldn't control how people would react. He could only control his own actions, his own honesty, his own willingness to face what he'd done. He stood and touched the cold stone of his headstone one last time. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the ghost of the boy he'd been. "I'm sorry for all of it." Then he walked back to the guest house, finally ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. David tried to occupy himself with reading, with walking, with anything that would distract him from watching the clock. Brought him breakfast and lunch, her presence professional but not unkind. Stopped by in the afternoon with updates on Richard's flight, which was on time and scheduled to land at 4. At 5:30 called. His car just turned onto the estate road. He'll be at the main house in 5 minutes. David's heart began to race. Should I come to the house? Give him 30 minutes to settle in. Let him have a drink, read through his mail, get comfortable, then come to the study. I'll make sure he's there. Those 30 minutes were the longest of David's life. He showered and changed into clean clothes, wanting to look presentable. He practiced what he would say, though he knew no amount of rehearsal could truly prepare him for this moment. At exactly 6 o'clock, David walked across the grounds to the main mansion. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It would have been beautiful if he'd been able to appreciate it. Met him at the door. Her expression was sympathetic but stern. He's in the study. Told him there's something important he needs to see. He doesn't know what yet. Are you ready? David nodded, not trusting his voice. Then go, and Mr. Henderson, whatever happens, at least you're being brave enough to try. The study was at the end of a long hallway lined with family photos. David walked past images of himself as a child, as a teenager, as a young man. The progression ended with his high school graduation photo, the last image ever taken of him as part of this family. After that, the photos were all of Christopher growing up, going to college, becoming a man in David's absence. He reached the study door and paused, his hand on the doorknob. Inside, he could hear the clink of ice in a glass, the rustle of papers, normal sounds of a man unwinding after a long trip. David took a deep breath and knocked. "Come in," Richard Henderson's voice called out. David opened the door and stepped inside. His father was standing at the window, his back to the door, looking out at the gardens. He was older than David remembered, his hair completely gray now, his shoulders a bit more stooped. But his posture was still commanding, still that of a man accustomed to authority. "Said you had something important to show me," Richard said without turning around. "I hope it's brief. It's been a long day and I'm tired." "It's important," David said, his voice catching, "and I don't think it will be brief." Richard froze at the sound of David's voice. The glass in his hand slipped, falling to the carpet with a soft thud, ice scattering across the floor. Slowly, as if afraid of what he might see, Richard turned around. Father and son stared at each other across the study. 15 years vanished in an instant, and yet stretched between them like an unbridgeable chasm. Richard's face cycled through emotions too fast to name: shock, disbelief, anger, joy, fear, hope. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Hi, Dad," David said simply. "I'm home." Richard took a step forward, then stopped. His hand reached out as if to touch David, to confirm he was real, then dropped back to his side. His eyes, so like David's own, filled with tears. "How," Richard whispered, "how is this possible?" "It's a long story," David said, "and not a pleasant one, but I'm here to tell you everything if you're willing to listen." Richard seemed to gather himself, drawing on decades of business negotiations and difficult conversations. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier, though still strained. "Sit down. You're right, this is going to take a while." They sat across from each other, father and son, with 15 years of secrets between them. And as the sun set completely and the study grew dark except for a single lamp, David began to tell his story once more. This time, it was to the person who mattered most, the one who had lived with the consequences of David's choices for a decade and a half. Richard listened without interrupting, his face impassive except for the occasional tightening of his jaw or clenching of his fists. When David finished, silence filled the room like a living thing. Finally, Richard spoke. "You broke my heart," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not when you disappeared. That was necessary. I understood that even if it killed me to do it. But you stayed away after the danger passed. You let me think you were dead for 8 extra years when you could have come home. Do you have any idea what that did to me? To Christopher?" "I'm sorry," David said, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry. I was a coward. I still am, but I'm trying to be better, for my daughter's sake, if not my own." Richard's head snapped up. "Your daughter?" "Her name is Emma. She's 6 months old, and her mother is Sarah, my wife. They're in Manhattan right now waiting to meet you and Christopher, or they were. I told Sarah the truth last night, and she may have taken Emma and gone back to Australia by now. I wouldn't blame her." Richard stood and walked to his desk, pulling out a bottle of whiskey far more expensive than the brandy they'd been drinking. He poured 2 generous glasses and handed one to David. "To new beginnings," Richard said, his voice heavy with irony, "and to the wreckage of old lies." They drank in silence. Then Richard set down his glass and looked at his son with an expression David couldn't quite read. "Christopher comes home tomorrow," Richard said. "He's bringing his girlfriend. They're planning to announce their engagement. This was supposed to be a happy family weekend. And now you're back from the dead, ready to blow up everything he thinks he knows about his life. Have you thought about how this will affect him?" "Every day for 15 years, David said. "It's one of the main reasons I stayed away. But I can't keep hiding forever, Dad, and he deserves to know the truth. He deserves to know his brother is alive." Richard nodded slowly. "You're right, he does. But I'm telling you right now, David, if you hurt that boy again, if you disappear or lie or cause him any more pain, I will cut you out of this family permanently. I don't care if you're my son. Christopher is my priority now. He has been ever since you left." The words stung, but David accepted them. "I understand. And I promise you I'm not going anywhere this time. Whatever happens, whatever anyone decides, I'm done running." Richard studied him for a long moment. Then, to David's surprise, the older man stepped forward and pulled his son into a fierce embrace. "I've missed you," Richard whispered. "God help me, I've missed you so much." David hugged his father back, feeling 15 years of walls crumble. They stood there in the study, 2 men trying to repair what had been broken, knowing it would take more than one conversation, more than one night, but willing to try. When they finally pulled apart, Richard's expression was determined. "Tomorrow is going to be difficult. Christopher deserves to hear this from both of us together. We need to present a united front, and we need to give him time to process before meeting your wife and daughter. This is going to be overwhelming." I know, and Dad, thank you for not giving up on me. Richard's smile was sad. You're my son. I couldn't give up on you even if I wanted to. That's what being a parent means. You'll understand that better now that you have Emma. They talked late into the night, filling in the gaps of 15 years. Richard told David about Christopher's achievements, his struggles, his growth into a fine young man. David shared carefully edited stories about his time abroad, his meeting with Sarah, the joy of becoming a father. They didn't solve everything that night. Some wounds were too deep to heal quickly, but they made a start, and sometimes that's all you can do. When David finally returned to the guest house after midnight, he found a message on his phone from Sarah. It was brief. Still here, still thinking. We need to talk more tomorrow. Morning came too quickly. David woke to sunlight streaming through the guest house windows and the immediate weight of what the day would bring. Christopher was arriving at noon with his girlfriend. In just a few hours, David would come face to face with the little brother who thought he'd been dead for 15 years. He showered and dressed carefully, choosing casual but neat clothing. He wanted to look approachable, not intimidating. Then he walked to the main house, where had already prepared breakfast in the formal dining room. Richard was there looking tired but resolute. He'd clearly not slept much either. Joined them his presence a quiet support. Served coffee and eggs, her movements efficient despite the tension in the room. How do you want to do this? David asked his father. Should I be here when Christopher arrives, or should you tell him first and then bring him to meet me? Richard considered this. I think we should tell him together. This isn't my secret to keep or reveal. It's our family's truth, and we both need to face it with him. But we should give him a few minutes to settle in first. Let him and Rachel get comfortable. Then we'll sit down together and explain everything. Rachel is his girlfriend? David asked. Richard nodded. Rachel Martinez. She's wonderful, a pediatric nurse, warm and caring. She's been good for Christopher. She grounds him in a way he needed. I think they're going to have a good life together. The words carried an unspoken message. Don't ruin this for him. David heard it clearly. At 11:45, reported that a car had turned onto the estate road. Richard and David moved to the study, the same room where they'd had their reunion the night before. David could feel his heart pounding. This was different from facing his father. Christopher had been a child when David left. He'd lost his brother during the years when he needed him most. David had no idea how his brother would react. They heard voices in the foyer, Christopher's laugh as he greeted. He sounded happy, carefree, in moments that would change forever. Dad, Christopher called out, we're here. In the study, Richard called back. Footsteps approached. David stood in the corner where he couldn't be immediately seen from the doorway. His hands were shaking. Christopher entered first, tall and handsome in his early 20s, with sandy brown hair and his father's warm smile. Behind him came a petite young woman with dark hair and kind eyes. This was Rachel, and David could see immediately what his father meant about her being good for Christopher. Dad, I want you to meet Rachel officially, Christopher said, his arm around her shoulders. Rachel, this is my father, Richard Henderson. Richard stood and shook Rachel's hand warmly. It's wonderful to finally meet you properly, Rachel. Christopher has told me so much about you. All good things, I hope, Rachel said with a smile. All excellent things, Richard assured her. Then his expression grew serious. Please, both of you, sit down. There's something I need to tell you, something that's going to be very difficult to hear. Christopher's smile faded. What's wrong? Is everything okay? Everything is, Richard paused, searching for words. Everything is about to change. Christopher, do you remember your brother David? The question seemed to confuse Christopher. Of course I remember him. Why are you asking me that? What do you remember about him? Christopher glanced at Rachel, clearly puzzled by this line of questioning. He was my brother. He died in a car accident when I was 7. I remember he was tall and always made me laugh. He taught me to ride a bike and swim. He used to read me stories before bed. Why are you bringing this up now? David stepped forward from the corner into Christopher's line of sight. The two brothers locked eyes, and the world seemed to stop. Christopher's face went white. He stood up so quickly his chair toppled backward. What is this? Who are you? Dad, what's going on? Christopher, Richard said gently, this is your brother. David is alive. No, Christopher said, backing away. No, that's not possible. David died. I was at his funeral. I watched them bury him. This is some kind of sick joke. Rachel stood and moved to Christopher's side, her hand on his arm. She looked between David and Richard with growing concern. Mr. Henderson, what's happening? David found his voice. Christopher, I know this is a shock. I know you have no reason to believe me, but I am your brother. I didn't die in that accident. I staged it, and I've regretted it every day since. Christopher's breathing was rapid, almost panicked. This isn't real. You can't be real. Dad, tell me this isn't happening. Richard moved closer to his younger son. It's true, Christopher. David is alive. He's been alive this whole time. And there's a lot you need to know, a lot we need to explain. Please sit down. Let us tell you everything. But Christopher wasn't ready to sit. He looked at David with a mixture of emotions so intense they were almost physical. You let me think you were dead? For 15 years? I was 7 years old. I cried for you every night for months. I used to go to your grave and talk to you, and you were alive the whole time. The pain in Christopher's voice was like a knife to David's heart. I'm so sorry. There were reasons, Christopher, not excuses, but reasons. Please let me explain. Reasons? Christopher's voice rose. What reason could possibly justify letting a 7-year-old boy think his brother burned to death? Do you have any idea what that did to me? How many years of therapy I needed? How scared I was that everyone I loved would disappear like you did? Rachel tried to calm him. Christopher, maybe we should sit down and listen to what they have to say. Christopher pulled away from her. Stay out of this, Rachel. This is family business. Then he immediately looked stricken. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. I can't process this. David took a cautious step forward. You have every right to be angry, every right to hate me. But please let me tell you what happened. Let me explain why I did what I did. I don't want your explanations, Christopher shouted. I want my childhood back. I want the brother who actually cared about me instead of the ghost who let me suffer for 15 years. Richard intervened, his voice firm. Christopher, that's enough. I understand you're upset, but you need to control yourself. David came back. He could have stayed away forever, but he's here trying to make things right. The least you can do is listen. Christopher laughed bitterly. Make things right? How do you make something like this right? You know what? Maybe you two deserve each other. Did you know about this, Dad? Did you know he was alive? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Richard's silence was answer enough. Oh my God, Christopher said, his voice breaking. You've known this whole time. You let me grieve, let me go to therapy, let me struggle with abandonment issues, and you knew he was alive. How could you do that to me? Richard's composure cracked. It was the only way to keep you safe. We had no choice. There's always a choice, Christopher shouted back. You chose to lie to me my entire life. You chose to let me think my brother was dead when he wasn't. What else have you lied about? What else don't I know about my own family? Rachel stepped forward again, her voice calm but concerned. Everyone needs to take a breath. This is clearly a very emotional situation, and maybe we should all sit down and discuss this rationally. Rationally? Christopher turned to her, tears streaming down his face. How am I supposed to be rational when my dead brother just walked out of a corner and my father admits he's been lying to me for 15 years? Nothing about this is rational. David felt his own tears falling. Christopher, please, I know I hurt you. I know what I did was unforgivable, but I was trying to protect you. There were people who wanted to hurt our family, dangerous people. If they'd known I was alive, they might have come after you to get to me. Faking my death kept you safe. Christopher wiped his eyes angrily. Don't you dare try to make yourself the hero in this story. Don't pretend you did this for me when you destroyed my childhood. You want to know what my life has been like? I've never been able to fully trust anyone because I'm always waiting for them to leave. I push people away before they can abandon me first. I've sabotaged relationships and friendships because I'm terrified of losing people the way I lost you. And now you're telling me it was all for nothing. That you were alive and could have come back at any time. Not at any time, David said desperately. The people who were after me weren't arrested until 8 years ago. Before that, it really was too dangerous. And the 7 years after that, Christopher demanded. What's your excuse for those? Were you still in danger, or were you just too much of a coward to face what you'd done? The accusation hit home because it was true. David had no defense, no justification that wouldn't sound hollow. You're right, he said quietly. I was a coward. I should have come back sooner. I should have found a way to let you know I was alive. I failed you in every possible way, and I'm sorry. Christopher shook his head. Sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't give me back 15 years. Sorry doesn't undo all the damage you caused. He looked at his father. And you? How am I supposed to trust you now? How do I know you're not lying about something else? Richard looked 10 years older than he had that morning. I don't know how to prove that to you, son. I can only tell you that I did what I thought was best at the time. I was trying to protect you. By lying to me, by letting me think my brother was dead. That's not protection, Dad, that's betrayal. Rachel moved closer to Christopher again, her voice gentle. Christopher, I think everyone here was trying to do what they thought was right, even if it turned out to be wrong. Maybe we should all sit down and talk through this properly. Going around in circles isn't helping anyone. Christopher looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're right, I'm sorry, I need some air, I need to think. He walked out of the study, leaving the others behind. Rachel looked apologetically at Richard and David. I'll go check on him, give him a few minutes to process this. After she left, David collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. That went about as badly as it could have. Richard poured himself a drink with shaking hands. What did you expect? You came back from the dead and destroyed everything he thought he knew about his life. Of course he's devastated. I know, I just hoped. I don't know what I hoped, that he'd understand maybe, that he'd be happy I was alive. He might be eventually, Richard said, but right now he's just hurt and angry, give him time. Appeared in the doorway. Mr. Henderson, Christopher, and Rachel have gone for a walk in the gardens. I thought you should know. Thank you. David stood and walked to the window. He could see Christopher and Rachel in the distance, walking along one of the garden paths. Rachel had her arm around Christopher's waist, and he was gesturing as he talked, clearly working through his emotions. David was grateful his brother had someone like her. I've destroyed everything, David said quietly. Sarah probably hates me, Christopher definitely hates me, and I've put Dad in an impossible position. Maybe I should have stayed dead. Don't say that, Richard said firmly. What's done is done. We move forward from here. Christopher will come around eventually. He's a good man and he has a good heart. He just needs time to process this. An hour passed, then 2. Finally, Christopher and Rachel returned to the house. Christopher looked calmer, though his eyes were red from crying. He found David and Richard still in the study, waiting. I want to hear everything, Christopher said without preamble. Every detail, every reason, every excuse, and then I'll decide what to do. They sat down, and for the 3rd time in 2 days, David told his story. This time he held nothing back. He talked about the money laundering, the threats, the fear. He talked about the decision to fake his death and how it had torn him apart. He talked about the years abroad, the loneliness, the guilt. He talked about Sarah and Emma and how becoming a father had changed everything. Christopher listened without interrupting, his face carefully neutral. When David finished, silence fell over the room. Finally, Christopher spoke. I understand why you did it initially. I even understand why Dad went along with it. But I don't understand why you stayed away after the danger passed. That's what I can't forgive. David nodded. I don't expect you to forgive me. I can barely forgive myself. All I can tell you is that I was wrong. I was scared and selfish, and I convinced myself that staying away was better for everyone. But I was lying to myself. The truth is, I didn't have the courage to come back and face what I'd done. Christopher looked at his father. And you, why didn't you tell me when the danger was over? Why keep lying? Richard's voice was heavy with regret. Because I didn't want to hurt you again. I didn't want you to know that your brother had chosen to stay away. I thought if you believed he was dead, at least you could remember him as he was, not as someone who abandoned you. It was wrong. I see that now. Christopher stood and walked to the window, staring out at the grounds. I need some time, he said finally. I can't just pretend everything is okay because David decided to come back. I need to figure out how I feel about all of this. That's fair, David said. Take all the time you need. Christopher turned to face them. But I'm not running away. I'm not going to disappear and leave things unresolved. That's what you did, David. I'm better than that. I'll work through this, but on my own terms and in my own time. Rachel, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. If it helps, Christopher, I think your brother is genuinely remorseful, and I think he's trying to do the right thing now, even if it's 15 years too late. That doesn't fix what happened, but it's something. Christopher looked at her with such love that David felt a pang of hope. His brother had found someone good, someone who could help him through this. You're probably right, Christopher said to Rachel. Then to David. I don't hate you. I want to hate you, but I don't. You're my brother, and apparently you're alive, which I guess is better than the alternative. But I need time before I can have any kind of relationship with you. Do you understand? Completely, David said. I'll be here, I'm not going anywhere. The rest of the day was awkward but less explosive. Rachel proved to be an excellent mediator, gently steering conversations away from dangerous topics and toward safer ground. She asked David about his travels, his work teaching English, the places he'd lived. She asked about Emma, and David showed her photos, grateful for the neutral subject. Christopher participated minimally, still processing everything. But he didn't leave, which David took as a positive sign. By evening, there was a tentative peace in the house, fragile but holding. That night, David drove into Manhattan to see Sarah. She'd agreed to meet him at a restaurant near their hotel, neutral ground where they could talk privately. He arrived first and waited at a corner table, his nerves frayed. Sarah arrived looking tired but composed. She dressed simply in jeans and a sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. She sat down across from him without greeting, her expression guarded. "I told my family," David said. "My father knows everything now, so does my brother. It was difficult." "I imagine it was," Sarah said coolly. "How did they react?" "My father was hurt but trying to understand. My brother is devastated and needs time. I don't blame him. I destroyed his childhood." Sarah studied him carefully. "I spent the last 2 days thinking about us, about our marriage, about Emma. I talked to my mother in Australia. I even called a therapist friend for advice." David's heart sank. This sounded like the beginning of goodbye. "And I've decided," Sarah continued, "that I'm not going to make any decisions right now. What you did to me, lying about who you are, is huge. It changes everything I thought I knew about you. But running away with Emma and never speaking to you again would be a decision made from anger, and I don't want to do that." Hope flickered in David's chest. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying I need time, just like your brother does. I need to process this. I need to meet your family and see you interact with them. I need to understand who you really are, not just the version of you I thought I knew. And then I'll decide if I can move forward with you or not." "That's more than I deserve," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "Maybe," Sarah agreed. "But it's what I need to do for myself and for Emma. She deserves to know her father, even if he's an idiot who made terrible choices." The ghost of a smile crossed David's face. "An idiot, that's accurate." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "David, I fell in love with you. That wasn't fake, at least not for me. But I need to know if the man I loved actually exists, or if he was just a character you created to hide from your past." "He exists," David said earnestly. "The person you know, the person who loves you and Emma more than anything, that's real. The lies were about my past, not about my feelings or who I am now." "Then prove it," Sarah said simply. "Show me that the man I married is real. Help your brother heal. Make things right with your family. Be the person you claim to be, even if you weren't before." David reached across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, Sarah let him take her hand. "I will. I promise you I will." They talked for another hour, Sarah asking questions about the past that David answered as honestly as he could. It was painful and difficult, but it was also necessary. By the end of the conversation, they weren't fixed, but they weren't broken beyond repair either. "Come to the estate tomorrow," David said. "Bring Emma. Let me introduce you to my family properly. Let them meet their granddaughter and niece." Sarah considered this. "Okay, but David, if at any point I feel like you're lying to me again or hiding something, I'm leaving. I mean it." "I understand. No more lies, no more secrets, I promise." The next day, Sarah arrived at the estate with Emma at noon. David met them at the gate, having been informed to expect them. The baby was awake and curious, her blue eyes taking in everything with wonder. Richard had agreed to meet them, though Christopher had decided he needed more time before dealing with a sister-in-law and niece he didn't know existed. Rachel was with him, helping him process everything. In the main house's living room, Richard Henderson met his granddaughter for the first time. The tough businessman who'd negotiated billion-dollar deals and built an empire melted completely when Emma grabbed his finger with her tiny hand. "She's beautiful," Richard said, his voice cracking. "She looks like her father did at this age." Sarah watched the interaction carefully, seeing how David's face lit up when he held his daughter, seeing the genuine emotion on Richard's face. This was real. This family was real, despite all the lies and secrets. Served lunch, and they ate together in the dining room. Sarah asked Richard about the family history, about David's childhood, getting a picture of the man she'd married beyond what he'd told her. Richard shared stories carefully, editing out the painful parts but giving her context. "I don't condone what my son did," Richard told Sarah honestly. "Lying to you about who he was isn't acceptable, but I want you to know that the core of who David is, the kind and caring person you fell in love with, that's real. He just lost his way for a long time." "I'm trying to believe that," Sarah said. "I'm trying to see past the lies to the truth underneath." In the afternoon, Christopher finally agreed to meet them. Rachel came with him, her presence a calming influence. He walked into the living room where David, Sarah, Richard, and Emma were gathered, and stopped short when he saw the baby. Emma was sitting on David's lap, chewing on a toy and babbling happily. When she saw Christopher, she smiled at him, her whole face lighting up. Something in Christopher's expression shifted. He moved closer, almost against his will, drawn by the sight of his niece. "Can I hold her?" he asked quietly. "Of course," David said, carefully transferring Emma to Christopher's arms. Christopher held her awkwardly at first, clearly not experienced with bobbies. But Emma seemed unconcerned, reaching up to grab his nose and giggling when he made a face at her. Despite himself, Christopher smiled. "She's perfect," he said, looking at David. "She deserves better than a family full of secrets and lies." "I know," David said, "and I'm going to make sure she grows up knowing the truth, all of it. She'll never have to wonder who she is or where she comes from. I'm going to be better for her." Christopher looked at his brother for a long moment. "You better be, because if you disappear on her the way you disappeared on me, I'll never forgive you." "I won't," David promised. "I'm done running." Over the next few weeks, the family slowly began to heal. It wasn't easy or quick. Christopher had good days and bad days, times when he could be around David normally, and times when the anger and hurt were too much. Sarah kept her promise to give David a chance, though she maintained boundaries and didn't let herself be swept up in easy forgiveness. And watched it all with a mixture of relief and concern. The truth had been revealed, but the consequences were still unfolding. The family would never be the same as it was before, but perhaps it could be something new, something honest. One evening, about a month after David's return, the whole family gathered for dinner. Richard sat at the head of the table, with Christopher and Rachel on one side, David and Sarah on the other. Emma was in a high chair, making a mess of her pureed vegetables and charming everyone in the process. "I want to propose a toast," Richard said, standing with his wine glass. "To the truth, no matter how painful, to family even when it's complicated, and to second chances which none of us deserve but all of us need." They raised their glasses, a family reunited but forever changed. The road ahead would be long and difficult. Trust had to be rebuilt, wounds had to heal, and relationships had to be reconstructed from their foundations. But they were together and they were trying, and sometimes that's enough. Christopher looked at his brother across the table. "I'm still mad at you," he said. "I might be mad at you for a long time." "I know," David replied, "and that's okay, you have every right to be." "But," Christopher continued, "Emma deserves to know her father and her uncle, so I'm willing to work on this, for her sake and maybe eventually for ours." David nodded, too emotional to speak. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. Stood in the doorway, watching the family eat dinner together. She thought about that morning weeks ago when she'd stood at the gate and refused entry to a stranger claiming to be David Henderson. She'd been doing her job, protecting the family. But in the end, protecting them had meant letting the truth in, no matter how much it hurt. The truth had been revealed, and now they all had to live with it. The billionaire had been blocked from entering his own house, and in that moment of confrontation, everything had changed. The secrets had been exposed, the lies had been acknowledged, and a family had been given a chance to become whole again. It wouldn't be easy. Some wounds take years to heal, and some scars never fully fade. But as watched Richard laugh at something Emma did and saw Christopher smile despite himself at one of David's jokes, she thought maybe, just maybe, they would be okay. The truth always has consequences. Sometimes those consequences are painful, and sometimes they're redemptive. For the Henderson family, the truth was both. It had destroyed the comfortable lies they'd been living with and forced them to confront difficult realities. But it had also given them something they hadn't had in 15 years, hope for a real future together. As dinner ended and the family moved to the living room, Sarah pulled David aside. "I've made a decision," she said. David's heart raced. "What decision?" "I'm going to stay, not because everything is fixed or because I've forgiven you completely, but because I can see you're trying to be better. I can see your family is trying. And I think Emma deserves to grow up knowing her father and her family, even if that family is complicated. Relief flooded through David. Thank you, I won't let you down again, I promise. Sarah looked at him seriously. See that you don't, because you won't get another chance. They rejoined the family, where Richard was telling Emma a story and Christopher was showing Rachel old photo albums. It was a normal family scene, the kind that happens in homes every day. But for the Hendersons, it was extraordinary. It was proof that even the most damaged relationships could begin to heal if people were willing to face the truth and do the work. Watched from her position near the doorway, ready to serve coffee or clear plates as needed. She'd been part of this family for over 20 years, had seen them through joy and tragedy, secrets and revelations. This latest chapter had been one of the most dramatic, but it was far from over. As she prepared to serve dessert, thought about that morning at the gate when she'd blocked the billionaire from entering his own house. At the time, she'd been doing what she thought was right, protecting the family from an intruder. But that intruder had been a ghost come back to life, a lost son returning home, a brother seeking redemption. Sometimes doing the right thing means standing firm at the gates. And sometimes it means opening them and letting the truth walk through, no matter how painful that truth might be. Had learned that lesson, along with the rest of the Henderson family. The evening ended with Christopher agreeing to come to Sunday dinner the following week. It was a small step, but it was progress. Rachel hugged Sarah goodbye, the two women already forming a friendship based on their shared experience of loving, complicated Henderson men. As David and Sarah prepared to leave with Emma, Christopher stopped them at the door. "Wait," he said. He looked uncomfortable but determined. "I've been thinking about what you said about wanting to be a better person for Emma's sake." "Yes," David said hopefully. "If you're serious about that, about being present and honest, then maybe we can find a way forward. I'm not saying I forgive you, and I'm not saying everything is okay. But maybe we can start building something new, not trying to recreate what we had before, but something different, something real." David felt tears prick his eyes. "I'd like that more than anything." Christopher nodded stiffly, then surprised everyone by reaching out and hugging his brother. It was brief and awkward, but it was genuine. When they pulled apart, both men had tears on their faces. "Don't screw this up," Christopher said, his voice rough with emotion. "I won't," David promised. As they drove away from the estate that night, Sarah asked David how he felt. He thought about it for a moment, watching Emma sleep in her car seat, thinking about the family he'd reclaimed and the one he'd built. "Hopeful," he said finally, "scared but hopeful." "That's honest," Sarah said. "I can work with honest." And as the lights of the Henderson estate faded behind them, David allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he really could make things right. The truth had been revealed, the consequences had been faced, and now the real work of healing could begin. Stood at the window of the main house, watching the car's taillights disappear down the drive. Behind her, Richard and were talking quietly, making plans for the future. The family had survived the revelation of David's return. They would survive what came next. She thought about the question people always ask in situations like this. Was it worth it? Was the pain of the truth worth it compared to the comfort of the lie? Didn't know if there was a universal answer to that question. But for the Henderson family, she believed the truth, however painful, was better than the alternative. Because lies, no matter how well-intentioned, always have a cost. They erode trust, damage relationships, and create shadows that darken even the moments. The truth might hurt, but it also heals. It allows for real connection, genuine relationships, and the possibility of authentic redemption. As turned away from the window and began preparing the house for the night, she felt a sense of peace. The family she'd served for so long was broken, but they were putting themselves back together. It would take time, patience, and a lot of hard work. But they were trying, and that was what mattered. The story of the man who was blocked from entering his own house had ended not with a dramatic reconciliation or a fairy tale resolution, but with something more valuable. A commitment to honesty, an acknowledgement of pain, and a willingness to do the difficult work of rebuilding trust. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a real one. And in the end, that's all any family can ask for. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't abandonment either. It was a door left open, a possibility. David went to bed that night feeling something he hadn't felt in 15 years, hope. The The truth had a way of demanding recognition, no matter how long it had been buried. And now that David Henderson had returned from the dead, nothing would ever be the same again.